Remember, all this privatization you hear about, it's supposed to be very efficient. And by some measure, by some ludicrous measure, it probably is efficient. And part of the reason why it's efficient is you don't count the costs, okay? So like if you, suppose they're talking about privatizing the MTA around here, the public transportation thing. All right, suppose you privatize the system. You and I know how to make it more efficient by the economist's measures. You throw out union workers and you get temps for half the price. And if there's an accident because they never had any training, well, it's just people who are getting killed. You don't measure that. And you cut off the so-called unprofitable bus routes, okay, or subway routes. Like you don't make a lot of money at 11 p.m., okay, so let's throw them out. Well, suppose somebody's stuck somewhere at 11 p.m. and wants to get home. Oh, well, it's entrepreneurial values, let them hire a limousine or something, and in ways like that, you can make the system more efficient simply by transferring the costs over to the public where you don't measure the costs, okay? So, it looks nice and efficient on some economist's paper, but of course there's huge costs transferred over to the public which you don't measure. We all know this, and that's what privatizing the educational system will be. Also, it's doing something else. It's going after exactly that moral conception that underlies the labor movement from its origins, namely, we're in it together. It's not just gain wealth forgetting all but self. Like we should care not only that my kid can go to school, but the kid down the street can go to school. That's what's being driven out of people's heads. There's a very powerful effort to drive any of that out of people's heads. You're only supposed to care about yourself, unless you're rich, of course. If you're rich, you're part of big socialist structures called corporations with strategic alliances and plenty of support from the state, and then you're allowed to have all these feelings about, yeah, we work together for us, the rich guys. But everybody else is supposed to be on their own. You're not supposed to care whether the kid down the street goes to school. It's like breaking, it should be very familiar to people in the labor movement. This is the main propaganda against the labor movement all the time. Right to work laws, everything else. You shouldn't work together. That's bad. If you work together, you might do something that matters, okay? So just be out on your own, and if you can get a voucher so maybe your kid can go to school, forget about everything else. Look, this is very much a business-run society, about the last figures I saw, about $1 out of $6 in the whole economy is spent on marketing. It's an extremely inefficient use of funds, of course. Marketing doesn't produce any public goods, but marketing is a form of manipulation and deceit. It's an effort to create artificial wants, to put people, to control the way people look and think about things. A lot of that marketing is straight propaganda, advertising. Incidentally, most of it is tax-free, or a lot of it is tax-free, which means the way our system works, you pay for the privilege of being propagandized, of having all this stuff dumped on you. Those are not small figures. That's like $1 trillion a year in 1992, something on that order. And yes, these when you've got that much of a commitment to controlling minds and manipulating desires and so on, and doing all the things they talk about in the public relations literature, I'm not making it up, you can read it there, and the social science literature, because this is also standard academic talk too. Well, when you've got those stakes, you're going to work on it hard, and it's going to be hard to fight against. That's what makes organizing tough. It's not just, well, you know way better than me, and I'm not going to talk about it, but you have to break through a lot of psychic resistance. The whole history of the labor movement tells you that. And as I say, this was well understood by mill hands in Lowell 150 years ago. But yeah, it's a big battle. And you're not just struggling against somebody who calls it a right to work act. You're struggling against 5 hours a day of television and the movie industry and the books and the schools and everything else. The scale of the efforts to win the battle for men's minds is enormous. I thought I knew something about this stuff, but when I read Elizabeth Phone's Wolf book, I was pretty shocked just to see the scale of the efforts. And the dedication, the frenzied dedication to winning this everlasting battle. It's really pretty pretty impressive, although if you think of the stakes, it's not too surprising.
I was curious about your remarks about the mill hands of Lowell, and that maybe the best idea was for them to own the firms themselves.
Okay, let's just talk about the principle. Okay, I mean, the principle, as far as I can see, goes right back to the Enlightenment. You know, like if you go back to classical Enlightenment thought, I'm now talking about Adam Smith and Jefferson and those guys. The sort of core idea is that people have the right to control their own work. Okay, that if a person, here I'll quote a standard formula back in the 18th century, leading heroes of the Enlightenment, is if a person if a person does beautiful work under external command, meaning for wages, we may admire what he does, but we despise what he is, because he's not a free human being. Okay, that goes all the way through classical liberal thought, Enlightenment thought. I mean, Alexis de Tocqueville says, under wage labor, the art advances, the artisan declines. Now, you find this going right into the working class movements in Lowell and Lawrence. I think that's just natural. I wouldn't try to convince anybody of it. It seems to me if you think about it, yeah, why should you work on command? I mean, if you work on command, you're some kind of slave. Why not work because it's coming out of your needs and interests? I mean, like, cheap for me to say, I'm in a fancy university in a science department and I can do that. One of the nice things about being in sciences at fancy university is you really do have workers' control. To a very large extent, we control what we do. Want to work on this topic, I work on that topic. I mean, you got to sell it to funders and this and that, but the degree of workers' control at the elite level is quite substantial. I mean, that's why it's such a privilege to be in a science department. Enormously privileged existence. Forget the money. If they paid you 1/10 the amount of money, it would still be a much better existence than working on command. Now, I think people do know that. I don't think that these Enlightenment ideas are hard to grasp. I think people know that if you work under external control, you may admire what the person does, but despise what he is, because his labor, the sort of central part of your life, is being done at somebody else's orders. And you're not controlling the way it's done, or why it's done, or how it's used, or anything else. Well, you can't have every individual controlling every single thing, but that's why you have democratic structures, because people control things together. Okay, I don't know how to. I wouldn't try to convince anybody of this, because I frankly just don't believe that everyone doesn't know it. I think maybe I'm sentimental, but it seems to me if you sort of cut away waves of, layers of distortion and delusion, these things that were considered pretty obvious 200 years ago are still obvious.